Under the blazing Caracas sun, Venezuela's armed forces have taken to the runways and coastal bases once again, this time under the direct order of President Nicolas Maduro's defense establishment. The move comes just days after the deployment of a US aircraft carrier strike group into the Caribbean Sea, an operation Washington describes as a counter-narcotics presence mission. Across television screens on state channel VTV, Venezuelans watched armoured vehicles roll onto the tarmac of La Carlota air base. Soldiers in camouflage fanned out with rifles ready, executing drills under the watchful gaze of Defence Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez. At the same time, on Isla de Margarita, just off the country's northern coast, artillery units and Marines rehearsed amphibious defences, simulating responses to what officials call external threats in the Caribbean theatre. I see that the United States military forces, the armed forces of the United States, are being used as mercenaries to kill. This has been stated by their main spokespeople. We are going to deploy around the world to kill, to murder. This is what is happening in the Caribbean, killing defenseless people, whether or not they are drug traffickers, killing and executing without due process. His statement, broadcast nationwide, set the tone of confrontation. He accused Washington of turning the region into what he called a zone of executions, referring to a series of US naval strikes that have recently targeted boats allegedly linked to Venezuelan narcotics routes. Padrino's rhetoric was not new, but his framing was sharper than ever. He tied the US operations directly to what Caracas views as a campaign of coercion and regime change. For him, the military exercises are Venezuela's way of saying, we will not be intimidated. Nearly 200,000 personnel have been deployed across the national territory for this exercise, he said. I must say, this does not detract from the daily deployment carried out by the Strategic Operational Command, General-in-Chief Domingo Hernandez Lares. 200,000 troops, by Venezuelan standards, a massive mobilization. Tanks, drones, and coastal defense missiles are all part of the display. Analysts note that such numbers likely include not just active soldiers, but also reservists, territorial militias, and members of pro-government civilian brigades. The show of force unfolds amid escalating tension between Washington and Caracas. The United States has accused Venezuela of sheltering drug traffickers and providing safe passage for illicit shipments across the Caribbean. Since early October, US forces under President Donald Trump's second administration have conducted a series of so-called maritime enforcement operations, actions that have destroyed or intercepted several small vessels. Venezuelan authorities insist these were not traffickers, but fishermen and civilians caught in crossfire. Padrino's accusation that the US military acts as mercenaries to kill reflects that grievance. On Isla de Margarita, cameras captured troops digging trenches and rehearsing air defense coordination. Officials say the drills simulate a foreign landing attempt, but the symbolism is unmistakable. A small Caribbean nation positioning itself against the world's largest navy. Fighting against all other threats, the threat of drug trafficking, the threats posed by armed terrorist groups, armed drug traffickers who aim to operate on the Venezuelan border. We are providing an effective response to all of this, Padrino Lopez declared. For him, the exercises are both defensive and political. They reaffirm loyalty to President Maduro and demonstrate that the armed forces remain the backbone of state power. Throughout the day, military convoys rumbled through Caracas neighborhoods, greeted by red-clad supporters waving national flags. On state television, anchors hailed the maneuvers as Bolivarian readiness in the face of imperial aggression. In contrast, Washington has not formally commented on the Venezuelan drills. Pentagon sources, speaking anonymously to US networks, described the Venezuelan display as theatrical. Yet the timing is delicate. American forces are already engaged in operations off Venezuela's northern coast, where intelligence cooperation with regional allies, including Colombia and several island nations, has intensified. Regional observers worry the situation could easily escalate. The Caribbean Sea, once a conduit for trade and tourism, is fast becoming a corridor of confrontation. At the same time, political currents within Venezuela are shifting. The country continues to face economic hardship, US sanctions, and a fractured opposition. Analysts at the Caracas-based think tank Provia note that military exercises serve a dual purpose, signaling sovereignty abroad while rallying domestic unity. Meanwhile, residents of La Carlota's surrounding districts reported hearing jet engines overhead as Sukhoi 30 fighters streaked across the sky. For many, it was a reminder of how deeply militarized Venezuelan society has become. Padrino's remarks drew immediate attention from international news agencies. His accusation that the US is executing without due process echoes a growing chorus of Latin American governments critical of recent US operations in the Caribbean. Cuba, Nicaragua and Bolivia each issued statements of solidarity within hours, calling the American actions violations of sovereignty. For Caracas, this is about asserting that Latin America should police itself. This is not just about Venezuela, one senior officer told reporters off camera. This is about our right to defend the Caribbean from foreign militarization. The drills themselves, however, are more about perception than actual combat readiness. Analysts at the International Crisis Group say Venezuela's military, while still sizable, struggles with aging equipment and fuel shortages. Yet the visual of disciplined ranks marching under the national flag remains a potent symbol of defiance. Still, every move carries risk. The presence of US aircraft carriers in nearby waters creates a tense proximity rarely seen since the Cold War. With communications channels between Washington and Caracas nearly frozen, a single miscalculation, a radar lock, a warning flare, could ignite a wider incident. As dusk falls over Caracas, state television continues its live coverage. Anchors repeat the defense minister's message: Venezuela will not kneel before imperial threats. The exercises are set to continue through the week, covering land, air and sea maneuvers from the Andean frontier to the Caribbean coast. For ordinary citizens, it means more roadblocks, more soldiers and more uncertainty. But within government circles, the drills are hailed as a triumph of sovereignty. President Maduro, though not yet seen on the field, is expected to address the troops in the coming days. His message, officials say, will emphasize unity between the people and the armed forces, civic military fusion, as Caracas calls it. Observers recall that Venezuela has conducted similar exercises before: Operation Bolivarian Shield in 2020, the 2023 Coastal Defence Games, and now the 2025 Readiness Campaign. Each was framed as a deterrent to foreign invasion, and each followed periods of diplomatic friction with the United States. What makes this one stand out is timing. It comes amid an intensifying US regional presence and an American administration openly determined to curb what it calls authoritarian influence networks in the hemisphere. For Washington, these operations are part of freedom of navigation and anti-trafficking campaigns. For Caracas, they are rehearsals for aggression. Diplomats across the region are urging restraint. Brazil's foreign ministry, now attempting to mediate quietly, reminded both sides of the 1948 Charter of the Organization of American States, an agreement that prohibits intervention in the internal affairs of member countries. Yet the language coming out of Caracas leaves little room for compromise. The defense minister's televised warning that Venezuela will respond effectively to all threats suggests a nation digging in for confrontation, not diplomacy. Back at La Carlota, soldiers assemble once more at sunset, forming neat rows as the national anthem blares from loudspeakers. The red, blue and yellow of the Venezuelan flag ripple across the runway. Padrino Lopez salutes his troops, a moment carefully framed for broadcast, but heavy with symbolism. These men and women are the guardians of our sovereignty. They train, they stand firm, and they will defend every inch of our territory. Off-screen commentators emphasize the scale of participation, nearly 200,000 personnel, and the cooperation between ground forces, the Navy, and the National Guard. By nightfall, the coverage shifts to an anchor in VTV's studio, summarizing the day. Venezuela's military remains on high alert, its leadership denouncing US imperial provocations, and its government preparing for what it calls a new era of hybrid confrontation. Outside official circles, the mood is mixed. Some citizens express pride, seeing the exercises as a defense of national dignity. Others, weary of economic crisis and shortages, view it as a costly spectacle meant to distract from hardship. In neighboring Colombia, officials are watching closely. Intelligence sources there suggest Venezuela has increased patrols near the border state of Apure, an area long plagued by clashes between criminal gangs and guerrilla remnants. Internationally, the exercises have reignited debate over the balance of power in the Caribbean. Russia and China, both allies of Caracas, have voiced support for Venezuela's right to self-defense. Moscow's foreign ministry released a short statement condemning US naval actions as destabilizing to regional security. In Washington, State Department spokespersons have avoided escalating the rhetoric, insisting that US forces are operating lawfully in international waters. But on Capitol Hill, hawkish lawmakers are calling for a tougher line against what they describe as Venezuelan militarization. As the week progresses, attention will turn to whether these maneuvers remain purely symbolic or if they foreshadow a deeper standoff. For now, the skies above Caracas thunder with the sound of engines, and on the coasts of Isla de Margarita, soldiers dig in, awaiting further orders. In the words of Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino, the message is unambiguous. Venezuela sees itself encircled but unbroken. We are providing an effective response, he repeats, against every threat, every aggression, every attempt to humiliate our sovereignty. And with that declaration, Venezuela enters another tense chapter in its long confrontation with the United States, one measured not just in weapons or ships, but in the relentless contest over who controls the narrative of the Caribbean.